The crystal chandeliers of the Montgomery estate sparkled like distant stars on that fateful spring evening in Connecticut, their light catching the tears that threatened to spill from Sarah Mitchell's hazel eyes. At 25, she stood in her plain black uniform, clutching a silver serving tray while the wealthy guests of New England's elite swirled around her in designer gowns and tailored suits. Mitchell! Barbara Montgomery's sharp voice cut through the elegant symphony playing in the background. How dare you serve the 82 Bordeaux when I specifically requested the 85? The estate matriarch's perfectly manicured hand gripped Sarah's arm, her blood-red nails digging into the fabric of her sleeve. Sarah's voice trembled. Mrs. Montgomery, I apologize, but Mr. Richard specifically asked for. Richard? Barbara's perfectly painted lips curved into a cruel smile. My son may own part of this estate, but I still run this household. Or have you forgotten your place because of your special friendship with him? The whispers began immediately, spreading through the ballroom like wildfire. Sarah could feel the judgmental stares of the guests, the barely concealed smirks of the other servants. Her friendship with Richard Montgomery, the estate's heir, had always been innocent, a connection forged through late-night conversations about books and dreams when he couldn't sleep and found her reading in the library during her night shifts. Mother, that's enough. Richard's voice rang out across the room. He strode toward them, his tall frame commanding attention, dark hair slightly disheveled as always. But before he could reach them, Barbara raised her hand. Actually, it's more than enough. Miss Mitchell, you're fired. Collect your things and leave my property immediately. Sarah's world spun. 3 years of service, of saving every penny to put herself through night school, of building a life, all crumbling because of a wine vintage and a wealthy woman's paranoia. Mrs. Montgomery, please, Sarah began, but Barbara cut her off with a wave. Security will escort you out. And Richard? She turned to her son, who had finally reached them. Remember what we discussed about your future with the company. Some associations are simply inappropriate. Richard's face paled. He looked at Sarah, then at his mother, then back at Sarah. The conflict in his eyes was obvious, but so was his silence. Sarah felt her heart crack as she watched him step back, choosing his inheritance over their friendship. As security approached, Sarah lifted her chin. You don't need to escort me. I know my way out. She handed her serving tray to another wide-eyed maid and walked toward the exit, her steps measured and dignified despite the humiliation burning in her chest. In her tiny room above the garage, Sarah quickly packed her meager belongings. Photos of her late parents, a few cherished books, the acceptance letter to her night classes at Hartford Community College, and the small savings she'd managed to accumulate. As she zipped her duffel bag, a knock at the door made her jump. Sarah? It was Alice Chen, the estate's cook and the closest thing to a friend she had among the staff. I brought you this. She pressed an envelope into Sarah's hands. It's not much, but it's what I can spare. There's also the address of my cousin in Boston. She runs a small hotel and needs help. Tears finally spilled down Sarah's cheeks as she hugged the older woman. Thank you, Alice. I don't know what to say. Say you won't let them break you, Alice whispered fiercely. You're better than this place, than all of them. Promise me you'll prove it. As Sarah's taxi drove through the ornate gates of the Montgomery estate for the last time, she watched the mansion's lights grow smaller in the rear window. Her mind wandered to the conversation she'd overheard last week, Barbara Montgomery's hushed phone call about troubled investments and missing funds. At the time, Sarah had dismissed it as not her business. Now, clutching Alice's envelope and watching her world crumble, she wondered if perhaps it should become her business after all. The taxi turned onto the main road, and Sarah squared her shoulders. She might have lost her job, but she hadn't lost her dignity or her determination. Barbara Montgomery had just made a terrible mistake. She'd given Sarah nothing left to lose, and everything to prove. In her pocket, her phone buzzed with a text. Unknown number, I'm sorry. I should have spoken up. R. Sarah deleted the message without responding. Sorry wouldn't pay her bills or restore her reputation. As the taxi merged onto the highway toward Boston, she made herself a promise. She would return to Hartford someday, not as a servant, but as someone the Montgomerys couldn't ignore or dismiss. And when that day came, they would learn that true power didn't lie in crystal chandeliers or vintage wines, but in the strength of one's character and the justice of one's cause. What she didn't know then was that her journey would uncover secrets far darker than wine vintages and social slights, secrets that would shake the very foundation of Hartford's high society, and change not only her life but the lives of everyone around her, forever. Boston's morning fog wrapped around Sarah like a cold embrace as she stood before the Harborview Hotel, a modest three-story building that had seen better days. Alice's cousin, Margaret Wong, greeted her with calculating eyes and a firm handshake. "Alice told me what happened at the Montgomerys," Margaret said, leading Sarah through the hotel's worn but clean lobby. "Their loss is my gain. But let me be clear, I run a respectable establishment. No drama, no scandal." Sarah nodded, clutching her duffel bag tighter. "I understand, Mrs. Wong. I'm here to work and study, nothing else." "Good. Your room's upstairs. Staff quarters are small but private. Started as a maid here myself 20 years ago, now I own the place." Margaret's expression softened slightly. "Hard work and smart decisions, that's how you rise in this world." The next few weeks passed in a blur of early mornings and late nights. Sarah worked as the hotel's front desk manager during the day and attended business classes at night, thanks to a transfer from Hartford Community College. She tried to forget about her life at the Montgomery estate, but memories haunted her dreams: Richard's silence, Barbara's cruel smile, the whispers that followed her out. One rainy evening, as Sarah was reconciling the day's accounts, an elegantly dressed woman approached the front desk. "Excuse me," the woman said, "I believe my reservation is under the name Caroline Pierce." Sarah froze. Caroline Pierce, one of Barbara Montgomery's closest friends and a regular guest at the estate's parties. Their eyes met, and recognition flickered across Caroline's face. "Well, if it isn't the little servant girl," Caroline smirked. "How quaint." Before Sarah could respond, Margaret appeared beside her. "Mrs. Pierce, welcome to Harborview. Sarah is our front desk manager now, and one of our most valued employees." The emphasis on Sarah's new position wasn't lost on Caroline, whose smile tightened. "How lovely. I do hope she serves you better than she served the Montgomerys." "Actually," Margaret replied smoothly, "she's also one of our brightest business students. Top of her class at Boston Bay College." Sarah's chest swelled with pride at Margaret's defense, but Caroline's next words doused it with ice. "Oh, you haven't heard?" Caroline's voice dripped with false concern. "The Montgomerys are pressing charges against her for theft. Apparently, some valuable items went missing during her hasty departure." "That's a lie." Sarah's voice shook with anger. "I never stole anything. The police report says otherwise, dear." Caroline examined her manicured nails. "Such a shame. Barbara was so upset when she discovered the missing jewelry. And poor Richard, defending you until the evidence became overwhelming." Margaret's hand gripped Sarah's shoulder. "Mrs. Pierce, your room is ready. Follow me, please." Later that night, in Margaret's office, Sarah paced frantically. "I didn't take anything, Margaret. You have to believe me." "Sit down," Margaret commanded, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey. "Tell me everything, and I mean everything, about your time at the Montgomerys." As Sarah recounted the events leading to her dismissal, including the overheard phone call about troubled investments, Margaret's expression grew increasingly thoughtful. "My sister-in-law works at First Hartford Bank," Margaret said finally. "She's mentioned rumors about the Montgomerys' accounts. Strange transactions, missing documentation." She studied Sarah intently. "You're smart, Sarah. Too smart to steal jewelry. But maybe smart enough to have seen something they don't want found." A knock at the office door interrupted them. It was David Chen, Margaret's nephew and the hotel's IT manager. "Aunt Margaret, you need to see this," he said, placing his laptop on the desk. "I've been monitoring the local news sites like you asked. They just posted about the Montgomery case." The article displayed a photo of Sarah from her employee ID, alongside quotes from Barbara Montgomery about a trusted employee's betrayal. The comments section already overflowed with judgmental speculation. "They're trying to destroy me," Sarah whispered, tears threatening to fall. No, Margaret corrected, they're trying to silence you. The question is, why? David cleared his throat. I might be able to help with that. Before I worked here, I interned at a cybersecurity firm. If someone's hiding financial irregularities. No, Sarah interrupted. I won't stoop to their level. Sometimes, Margaret said quietly, the only way to fight fire is with fire. You're not alone anymore, Sarah. The question is, are you ready to fight back? Sarah stared at her reflection in the window, remembering Alice's words, say you won't let them break you. Behind her, Boston's lights twinkled like the chandeliers of the Montgomery estate, but she wasn't the same person who had served beneath those crystals. The Montgomerys think they can bury me under false accusations, Sarah said, turning back to Margaret and David. But they forgot something important, a buried seed doesn't die. It grows. Good, Margaret nodded approvingly. David, show her what you found. Sarah, tomorrow you start learning about corporate finance and digital forensics. If they want to play dirty, we'll show them what real power looks like. As David began explaining his findings, Sarah's phone buzzed again. Another text from Richard, the jewelry accusation isn't true. I know you didn't do it. Let me help. Sarah showed the message to Margaret, who shook her head. Men like Richard Montgomery don't help people like us, Sarah. They just ease their guilt while protecting their inheritance. But as Sarah stared at the message, a plan began forming in her mind. Richard's guilt might not be useful, but his access to the Montgomery estate's records certainly could be. The question was, how far was she willing to go to clear her name and uncover the truth? In the distance, thunder rolled across Boston Harbor, as if nature itself was anticipating the storm to come. Sarah Mitchell, the former servant girl, was about to become the Montgomery family's worst nightmare, not with stolen jewelry, but with the power of truth and the strength of those who had nothing left to lose. What she didn't know was that her fight for justice would uncover a web of lies and corruption that went far beyond the Montgomery family, reaching into the highest echelons of New England society. And somewhere in that web lay a secret that could change everything, if she lived long enough to expose it. 2 months after Caroline Pierce's visit to the Harborview Hotel, Sarah sat in David Chen's cramped office, surrounded by computer screens displaying financial records and email chains. Her business classes in David's patient tutoring had taught her to see the numbers for what they really were, breadcrumbs leading to something far more sinister than simple theft. Look at this, David pointed to a spreadsheet. Every month for the past year, exactly $250,000 has been transferred from the Montgomery Foundation to a shell company called Evergreen Ventures. The paperwork looks perfect, but the Montgomery Foundation is supposed to support local charities, Sarah finished. I remember serving at their fundraising galas. Barbara always made such a show of presenting those oversized checks to children's hospitals. Exactly. And Evergreen Ventures? David typed rapidly. Doesn't exist. At least, not anymore. It dissolved 3 days after you were fired. Sarah's phone buzzed, another message from Richard, mother's becoming paranoid. She's hired private security. Whatever you're doing, be careful. This time, Sarah responded, meet me. Tomorrow. 3 p.m. Boston Public Garden. Come alone. Are you sure about this? Margaret asked from the doorway, where she'd been listening. Richard Montgomery isn't exactly trustworthy. No, Sarah admitted, but he's scared. And scared people make mistakes. The next day, Sarah sat on a bench near the swan boats, watching families paddle across the pond. She'd traded her hotel uniform for a sophisticated blue dress, courtesy of Margaret's insistence that appearance is armor in this war. Richard appeared exactly at 3, looking thinner than she remembered. His designer suit couldn't hide the dark circles under his eyes. You look well, he said, sitting beside her but maintaining a careful distance. Amazing what happens when you're not serving others, Sarah replied coolly. Why did you really come, Richard? He glanced around nervously. You need to stop digging. Mother, she's not well. The accusations against you were her idea. I tried to talk her out of it, but you didn't try hard enough, Sarah cut in. Just like you didn't defend me that night. You don't understand.
The foundation. Is laundering money through fake charities?
Sarah watched his face pale. That's what this is really about, isn't it?
Not some missing jewelry.
Barbara found out I overheard her phone call about the investments. Richard grabbed her arm, his fingers trembling.
Keep your voice down. You have no idea what you're dealing with.
This goes beyond Mother, beyond our family.
Then help me understand, Sarah challenged. Or are you too afraid to face the truth about your family's legacy? Before Richard could respond, a black SUV pulled up to the curb.
The window rolled down, revealing Barbara Montgomery's cold smile.
"Richard, darling, get in the car," she called out.
Her eyes locked onto Sarah.
"Miss Mitchell, I see you're still causing trouble. Perhaps we should have this conversation somewhere more private?" Sarah stood, straightening her spine.
"I prefer public places, Mrs. Montgomery.
Fewer chances for misunderstandings about missing jewelry." Barbara's smile didn't waver. "Very well. Enjoy your afternoon. Oh, and Sarah? Do give my regards to Margaret Wong.
Such a quaint little hotel she runs."
As the SUV pulled away with a reluctant Richard inside, Sarah's phone rang. It was David.
"Sarah, get back here now," his voice was urgent.
"Someone tried to hack our system. They were looking for your files."
"I'm on my way." Sarah started walking quickly, her heels clicking on the pavement.
"David, I need you to do something for me. Find everything you can about Evergreen Ventures." "And David?"
"Look for connections to other prominent families in Hartford, not just the Montgomerys."
Back at the Harborview, Sarah found Margaret and David huddled over a laptop.
"The hack was sophisticated," David explained.
"But they left traces. Whoever did this has tried to access records at other hotels in the area. They're tracking someone," Margaret mused. "Sarah, what exactly did Richard say about his mother?"
Before Sarah could answer, Alice Chen burst into the office, her face ashen.
"Sarah, turn on the news. Now." The local station was running breaking news: tragic accident at Montgomery Estate. Family chef Alice Chen found unconscious in apparent gas leak. Sources say victim in critical condition.
Sarah's world tilted. Alice, who had helped her, supported her, warned her. This was no accident. "I have to go to the hospital." Sarah grabbed her purse, but Margaret blocked the door.
"Think. This is exactly what they want. You show up at the hospital, they arrest you for the jewelry theft." Margaret's eyes were fierce. "Alice helped you escape them once. Don't waste her sacrifice." "Then what do I do?" Sarah's voice cracked. "They're hurting people I care about."
"You fight smarter," David spoke up.
"While they're watching the hospital, I can access their network. They'll be distracted." Margaret nodded.
"And I have an idea about those other hotel searches."
"Sarah, remember last month when that retired judge stayed here? Judge Catherine Sullivan? The one who always requested extra towels," Sarah recalled. "What about her?"
"She used to oversee financial cases in Hartford," Margaret revealed. "And she's been moving from hotel to hotel for the past month, never staying more than a few days."
Sarah's mind raced.
A judge who handled financial cases, hiding from someone.
"David, can you?" "Already on it," he typed rapidly.
"Judge Sullivan presided over a case 6 months ago."
"Something about, wait."
He stared at the screen. "The records are sealed, but the defendant was Evergreen Ventures."
Sarah sank into a chair. "It's all connected.
The foundation, the sealed case, the judge in hiding." She looked up at Margaret and David.
"We need to find Judge Sullivan before they do." "And then what?" Margaret asked softly.
Sarah's phone buzzed one last time, a final message from Richard: "I'm sorry about Alice.
But please stop. Next time, it won't be just a gas leak."
Sarah deleted the message, her hands steady despite the rage building in her chest.
"Then we show them that some servants refuse to be silenced. And some secrets are too dangerous to keep."
As night fell over Boston, 3 people huddled in a small hotel office, plotting against one of New England's most powerful families.
Outside, a black SUV circled the block, its occupants watching and waiting. And in a hospital room across the city, Alice Chen fought for her life, carrying secrets that could bring down not just the Montgomerys, but an entire network of corruption that ran through the heart of Hartford's elite. The game had changed. It was no longer about cleared names or stolen jewelry. Now it was about justice, truth, and survival. And Sarah Mitchell, the former servant who had once polished silver and poured wine, was about to prove that real power doesn't come from wealth or status, but from the courage to stand against those who abuse it. What she didn't know was that Judge Sullivan's secret would test not just her courage, but her very understanding of justice itself. And somewhere in Hartford, Barbara Montgomery was making a phone call that would set in motion events that none of them could have predicted. The trail to Judge Catherine Sullivan led them to a modest bed and breakfast in Salem, Massachusetts. 3 days after Alice's accident, Sarah found herself sitting across from the former judge in a small garden, fallen autumn leaves swirling around their feet. "I was wondering when someone would find me," Judge Sullivan said, her silver hair catching the afternoon light. Despite her evident exhaustion, her eyes remained sharp. "Though I must admit, I didn't expect it to be a former servant of the Montgomerys." "You know who I am?" Sarah leaned forward. "My dear, everyone in certain circles knows about you now." The judge sipped her tea. "The servant girl who dared to challenge Barbara Montgomery. But they don't know what I know." "And what's that?" "That you're not here about jewelry theft." Judge Sullivan's hands trembled slightly as she set down her cup. "You're here about Evergreen Ventures and the Montgomery Foundation. About money that disappeared in charities that never existed. About a case I should have pursued further, before they forced me to retire." Sarah glanced at her phone. A text from David: "Security cameras show 2 black SUVs entering Salem. 20 minutes out. Be careful." "We don't have much time," Sarah said urgently. "Please, what really happened with Evergreen Ventures?" The judge's face darkened. 6 months ago, a whistleblower brought evidence of massive financial fraud. Not just the Montgomerys, at least a dozen of New England's most prominent families were involved. They were using charitable foundations to launder money, millions of dollars filtered through shell companies and offshore accounts. "But you sealed the case." "Because they gave me no choice." Judge Sullivan's voice cracked. "My grandson, they arranged an accident for him too. A brake failure on his motorcycle. The message was clear: drop the case, or next time he wouldn't survive." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, thinking of Alice lying in a hospital bed. "Just like they did to my friend." "Exactly. But I didn't just seal the case." The judge reached into her handbag, withdrawing a small USB drive. "I kept evidence. Names, dates, transaction records, everything the whistleblower provided. I've been moving from place to place because I know they're looking for this." "Who was the whistleblower?" Before Judge Sullivan could answer, Sarah's phone buzzed again. "David, SUVs spotted 2 blocks away." "Get out now." "We have to go." Sarah stood quickly. "Come with us. We can protect you." The judge shook her head, pressing the USB drive into Sarah's hand. "No, my dear. I'm tired of running. But you still have the strength to finish what I couldn't. The whistleblower's identity is on that drive. Find them. They're the key to everything." "Catherine." A familiar voice rang out across the garden. Richard Montgomery stood at the gate, looking more haggard than ever. "Mother knows you're here. She's coming." Sarah stepped protectively in front of the judge, but Catherine Sullivan stood calmly. "Richard Montgomery. You look just like your father did at your age. Does your mother know you're warning them?" Richard's face contorted with emotion. "I can't stop her anymore. She's not the same since father died. Please, just give her what she wants." "What she wants is to bury the truth," Sarah snapped. "Like she tried to bury me under false accusations. Like she tried to silence Alice." "Alice?" Richard's eyes widened. "Sarah, I swear I didn't know about that. Mother said she just wanted to scare her." "Well, she's in a coma instead." Sarah's voice shook with rage. "Still want to defend your mother's actions?" The sound of cars pulling up outside made them all freeze.
Barbara Montgomery's voice carried over the garden wall, secure all exits.
Find that drive.
The back gate, Richard said quickly.
Through the kitchen.
I'll stall them. Sarah turned to Judge Sullivan.
Please, come with me.
Go, the judge insisted.
I'll handle Barbara.
I've been running for months, maybe it's time to face her directly.
But the truth is in your hands now.
Catherine Sullivan straightened her spine, looking every inch the federal judge she once was.
Don't let them bury it again.
Sarah slipped through the kitchen just as Barbara Montgomery's voice rang out. Catherine, darling. Such a quaint hiding place you've chosen. In the narrow alley behind the bed and breakfast, Sarah found Margaret waiting in her car.
Drive, Sarah gasped, clutching the USB drive. David texted you?
He's been monitoring police frequencies. Margaret pulled away from the curb.
There's a roadblock being set up on the main highway. They're not even trying to be subtle anymore. Sarah's phone rang, an unknown number.
She answered on speaker.
Miss Mitchell. Barbara Montgomery's voice was silk over steel. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Let's discuss terms. Let's discuss Alice Chen instead, Sarah countered. Or Judge Sullivan's grandson.
Or all the children's hospitals that never received their donations. You're playing a game you can't win, Barbara's tone hardened.
Ask Catherine what happens to people who defy me.
In the background, Sarah heard Judge Sullivan's clear voice. Tell her, Barbara.
Tell her what really happened to Edward Montgomery. The line went dead. Edward Montgomery? Margaret asked as they took back roads toward Boston. Richard's father?
He died 2 years ago, Sarah remembered.
Heart attack in his sleep, according to the papers.
She stared at the USB drive in her hands.
What if it wasn't?
Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from David, found something in the Harborview's old guest records. Edward Montgomery stayed there the night before he died.
In a room registered under a fake name. Turn around, Sarah said suddenly. We need to get back to the hotel. What? Why? Because I think I know who the whistleblower was. Sarah's mind raced.
Edward Montgomery died right after Evergreen Ventures was established. The judge said I looked just like my father at my age.
Margaret's eyes widened in understanding. You think Edward Montgomery was trying to expose his own wife's criminal empire?
And paid for it with his life, Sarah whispered. No wonder Richard is so conflicted. He must suspect the truth about his father's death. As they drove through the gathering dusk, Sarah's phone lit up with one final message, from Judge Sullivan herself. The evidence is only part of the truth.
Check the date on Edward Montgomery's last will and testament. And Sarah?
Trust no one completely, not even those closest to you.
In Boston, David Chen stared at his computer screen, his face illuminated by data he was uncovering from the USB drive.
His fingers froze over the keyboard as one particular document opened, a photograph that would change everything they thought they knew about Sarah Mitchell's connection to the Montgomery family. And in Salem, Barbara Montgomery watched Judge Catherine Sullivan with cold eyes, holding a familiar piece of jewelry, a locket that had belonged to Sarah's mother, containing a secret that could shatter all their lives. The truth about Edward Montgomery's death was just the beginning. The real story, the one that would shake New England society to its core, was about to emerge from the shadows, carrying with it a revelation that would force Sarah to question everything she thought she knew about her own identity. What she didn't realize was that the next 24 hours would not only expose the truth about the Montgomerys' crimes but would also reveal a family secret so explosive that it would change her life forever, if she survived long enough to learn it. The Harborview Hotel's security footage from 2 years ago flickered on David's computer screen. Sarah leaned forward, watching a familiar figure enter the lobby, Edward Montgomery, looking nervous, clutching a manila envelope. He stayed in room 342, David said, scrolling through old records.
Under the name Edward Mitchell. Sarah's breath caught. Mitchell?
But that's... Your last name, Margaret finished, her face grim.
Sarah, there's something else. That photo I found on the drive.
She hesitated, looking at David. He pulled up another file.
This was taken 26 years ago. The image showed a much younger Edward Montgomery standing in a hospital, holding a newborn baby.
Next to him was a woman Sarah had only seen in photographs, her mother, Catherine Mitchell.
"No," Sarah whispered. "That's impossible."
"The DNA test results were in Edward's envelope," David said quietly. "Along with letters from your mother."
"He was my father." The words felt foreign on Sarah's tongue. Edward Montgomery was my father.
The hotel room spun around her. Every interaction with the Montgomery family took on a new light: Barbara's intense hatred, Richard's conflicted behavior, the strange way Edward used to smile at her when she served his evening tea. "Barbara must have known," Margaret mused. "It explains why she was so threatened by your friendship with Richard. He's your
half-brother." Sarah stood abruptly, pacing the small office. "All this time, I was serving my own family and didn't know it. But Edward knew. He hired me on purpose, didn't he?" David nodded.
"According to these letters, he'd been keeping track of you your whole life. Making anonymous donations to your mother's medical care when she was sick, ensuring you got the job at the estate. And then he found out about Barbara's criminal enterprise," Sarah continued, the pieces falling into place.
"He was gathering evidence, planning to expose it all."
"And died suddenly in his sleep," Margaret finished.
"The night after he stayed here." Sarah's phone rang. "Richard." "Sarah?"
"Don't hang up," he sounded breathless.
"Mother has Judge Sullivan. She's not well. She keeps talking about father, about secrets." "Did you know?" Sarah demanded. "About Edward being my father?" A long pause. "I found out after he died. There was a letter in his study, explaining everything. I wanted to tell you, but Mother." "Threatened you? Like she threatened the judge's grandson? Like she had Alice poisoned?" "You don't understand. The night Father died, I saw Mother leaving his room. She was holding a glass."
Richard's voice cracked.
"Sarah, I think she killed him."
"And now she has the judge, and she's talking about tying up loose ends."
Sarah's blood ran cold. "Where are they?" "The old Montgomery summer house in Newport." "Sarah, be careful. Mother's not alone. She has people with her. Professional people. Like the ones who tampered with the judge's grandson's motorcycle? Worse. Sarah, there's something else you need to know. Father left you something in his will. A controlling interest in Montgomery Enterprises, to be revealed on your 26th birthday." Sarah sank into a chair. "When is?" "Tomorrow," Richard finished.
"That's why Mother's panicking. When the will is read, you'll have the power to expose everything."
"She's not going to let that happen." David suddenly grabbed Sarah's arm, pointing to his screen. He'd been digging through Edward's encrypted files from the USB drive.
A video began to play: Edward Montgomery, recording himself 2 days before his death. "My dearest Sarah," Edward's familiar voice filled the room. "If you're watching this, then Barbara has probably succeeded in silencing me. But she doesn't know about the offshore account, the one containing proof of every illegal transaction, every shell company, every bribed official. The access codes are hidden in the locket your mother always wore, the one I gave her the day you were born.
Find it, and you can bring down their entire empire."
Sarah touched her neck reflexively, remembering the locket she'd lost years ago.
"The locket."
"Mother has it," Richard said, having heard the video.
"She took it from Judge Sullivan an hour ago. Sarah, she's going to destroy it." Margaret stepped forward. "Not if we get there first." "It's a trap," David warned. "They'll be expecting you." "Good," Sarah's voice was steel. "Because I'm done running. Richard, can you help us get into the summer house?"
"The old servant's entrance."
"The code is still your birthday." A bitter laugh. "Father's idea, I suppose." "Sarah. I'm sorry. For everything."
"Prove it," she challenged. "Help me finish what our father started." As they prepared to leave for Newport, Sarah's phone chimed with a message from the hospital. Alice had woken up.
And she had something urgent to tell Sarah about the night Edward Montgomery died.
In Newport, Barbara Montgomery stood at the window of the summer house, holding a golden locket and a glass of wine. Behind her, Judge Sullivan sat bound to a chair, while two men in dark suits stood guard. "You really think you can silence everyone, Barbara?" the judge asked quietly. "The truth has a way of emerging."
The truth? Barbara laughed coldly. The truth is that Edward betrayed me.
With that servant girl's mother, with his ridiculous moral crusade.
But I won't let his bastard daughter destroy everything I've built.
"You mean everything you've stolen?" Catherine Sullivan corrected.
Tell me, does Richard know you killed his father? Barbara's hand tightened around the wine glass. My son understands the importance of family legacy.
"Unlike my dear departed husband. Edward's legacy is about to walk through that door," the judge smiled. "And she has more of him in her than you ever realized." Barbara turned, her face illuminated by the setting sun.
"Yes, I'm counting on that."
"Sarah's so much like her father, same moral courage, same tragic flaw."
She lifted the wine glass.
"They both think love can conquer greed." Unknown to Barbara, Richard Montgomery was already disabling the security cameras, his hands shaking as he prepared to betray his mother to protect the half-sister he'd watched from afar for years. And in a car racing toward Newport, Sarah Mitchell, daughter of a servant and a millionaire, heir to a fortune built on corruption, prepared to face the woman who had murdered her father and threatened everyone she loved. What none of them knew was that Alice Chen's urgent message would change everything.
Because the night Edward Montgomery died, she hadn't been the only one in the kitchen.
Someone else had helped Barbara prepare that final, fatal glass of wine, someone whose betrayal would prove more devastating than anything Sarah could imagine. The sum of all their choices was rushing toward a collision that would shake the foundations of New England society. And at its heart was a simple golden locket, containing not just bank codes, but a second secret, one that even Edward Montgomery hadn't known about. The text from the hospital replayed in Sarah's mind as Margaret's car sped toward Newport. "Miss Mitchell, Alice Chen is asking for you.
She says it's about Margaret Wong and the night your father died." "Sarah?" Margaret glanced at her from the driver's seat. "You've been quiet since that hospital message. What did Alice say?" Sarah studied the woman who'd given her shelter, taught her strength, become almost like a second mother. "Just that she's awake," she lied, remembering Judge Sullivan's warning, "trust no one completely." The Newport summer house loomed ahead, its Victorian architecture casting long shadows in the setting sun. Richard had texted the guard rotations and entry codes, proving his commitment to their cause. Or perhaps laying a trap. "David's in position," Margaret said, parking in a secluded spot. "He's looped the external cameras. We have 20 minutes before the security system resets." Sarah's phone buzzed, another message from the hospital. "Alice Chen insists, ask Margaret about May 15, 2022. The night Mr. Montgomery had his last glass of wine." The date hit Sarah like a physical blow. May 15, 2022, the night her father died. The night Margaret Wong had been visiting her sister-in-law at the Montgomery estate. "Sarah?" Margaret touched her arm. "We should move." Sarah pulled away. "You were there that night, weren't you?" "The night my father died." Margaret's face remained impassive. "What are you talking about?" "Alice saw you in the kitchen with Barbara." "What did you do, Margaret? What did you help her put in his wine?" A long silence filled the car. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice was different, harder, older. "You don't understand what your father did to my family." "What?" 20 years ago, Edward Montgomery discovered my brother was embezzling from the company. Instead of pressing charges, he blackmailed him, forced him to be his informant in the Asian markets. My brother killed himself 3 months later." Sarah felt sick. "So you helped Barbara murder him?" "I helped restore balance." Margaret's eyes were cold now. "When Barbara approached me about Edward's investigation into the foundation, I saw my chance." "Your father wasn't the saint you think he was, Sarah." "And Alice? Was poisoning her part of restoring balance too?" "A regrettable necessity. She saw too much that night. Just like she saw me talking to Barbara yesterday." Margaret reached into her jacket, producing a small revolver. "I'm truly sorry, Sarah."
You're a remarkable young woman, but I can't let you destroy everything we've built.
We? Sarah's mind raced.
You're part of it all, the foundation, Evergreen Ventures.
Someone had to manage the accounts Barbara couldn't touch.
Having a humble hotel owner as a partner, no one looked too closely at my books. A flash of movement caught Sarah's eye. Richard, signaling from the servants' entrance.
Margaret saw it too.
Ah, the prodigal son arrives. She smiled grimly.
Did you really think he'd choose you over his inheritance?
Richard's been playing both sides, dear. Telling you enough truth to gain your trust while keeping his mother informed of every move.
You're lying. Am I? Ask him about the locket.
Ask him who really took it from your room at the estate.
Before Sarah could respond, Margaret's phone chimed.
She checked it, then smiled.
That's our cue.
Barbara's waiting for us.
You mean waiting for me, Sarah corrected.
All this time, you were supposed to deliver me to her.
You and the USB drive. Consider it your father's final contribution to our cause. Margaret gestured with the gun. Shall we? They walked toward the house, Sarah's mind working furiously. If Margaret was lying about Richard's betrayal, she had allies waiting. If not, the servants' entrance opened into a dimly lit corridor. Barbara Montgomery's voice drifted down from above, in the study, Margaret dear. And do make sure our guest is unarmed.
The study was exactly as Sarah remembered from childhood charity events, leather-bound books, crystal decanters, old money arrogance in every detail. Barbara stood by the fireplace, the golden locket dangling from her fingers. Judge Sullivan sat bound in an armchair, while Richard lingered by the window, not meeting Sarah's eyes.
The prodigal daughter returns, Barbara's smile was triumphant.
Or should I say, my dear stepdaughter?
How fitting that Edward's last little secret should help dismantle his legacy.
You murdered him, Sarah spat.
With considerable help, Barbara nodded toward Margaret. Amazing what shared hatred can accomplish. Edward destroyed Margaret's family.
He betrayed me with your mother. He threatened everything we built with his sudden attack of conscience.
And the foundation? The stolen charity funds? An unfortunate necessity.
Running an empire requires certain moral sacrifices.
Something your father never understood. Barbara held up the locket. Just like he never understood the true value of this trinket. The bank codes, Sarah said. Barbara laughed.
Oh, my dear. Edward's offshore accounts were a tidy sum, but hardly worth killing for. No, this locket contains something far more precious.
She clicked it open.
Your mother's final letter to Edward, detailing a secret about your birth that even he never knew.
Sarah's heart stopped. What secret?
Tell her, Richard, Barbara commanded.
Tell her what you learned when you stole this from her room.
Richard finally met Sarah's eyes, his face tortured.
You're not just my half-sister, Sarah. We're twins. The room spun. That's impossible.
Your mother was our surrogate, Barbara's voice dripped contempt. Edward's mistress, carrying his legitimate heir and her own child simultaneously. A medical miracle, they called it. Heteropaternal superfecundation, twins with different mothers but the same father.
A secret Edward took to his grave, Margaret added.
Until Richard found the letter. Sarah looked at her half-brother, her twin, seeing their shared features in a horrifying new light.
You knew? All this time?
I found out the night I took the locket, Richard's voice broke. Mother said she needed it to protect our inheritance. I didn't know she was planning to kill him. But you suspected, Judge Sullivan spoke up.
Just like you suspected Sarah was more than just a servant. That's why you befriended her, isn't it? Guilt over the sister you were raised to despise? Enough family therapy, Barbara snapped.
She turned to Sarah. Tomorrow, you would have inherited controlling interest in Montgomery Enterprises. Instead, you'll suffer a tragic accident, the unstable servant girl, consumed by vengeful delusions, taking her own life in the same house where her father died.
And if I refuse to cooperate? Barbara nodded to one of her men. He pressed a phone to Sarah's ear. Sarah? David's voice was strained. They have me. I'm sorry. You see? Barbara smiled. Even the most loyal allies can be turned with the right motivation. Now, about that USB drive. What no one in the room knew was that at that exact moment, Alice Chen was sharing the final piece of the puzzle with Boston police, evidence that would shatter Barbara's empire and reveal one last, devastating betrayal. Because the night Edward Montgomery died, there had been a third person in that kitchen. Someone whose true role in this tragedy was about to turn everything upside down. And Sarah, standing in her father's study surrounded by lies and betrayal, was about to learn that sometimes the deepest wounds come from those we trust the most. The study's antique clock struck midnight as Sarah stared at the locket in Barbara's hands, her mind racing through years of memories. Every smile from Edward, every lingering look, every small kindness, all haunted now by the knowledge that she wasn't just his illegitimate daughter, but part of a pair torn apart by wealth and privilege. Twins, she whispered, looking at Richard. That's why you always felt familiar, even before we became friends. Enough sentimentality, Barbara cut in. The USB drive, Sarah. Now. Sarah reached into her pocket, feeling the small device that contained her father's evidence. First, let me speak to David again. Barbara nodded to her man, who redialed. But this time, instead of David's voice, they heard something else, police sirens. What's happening? Barbara demanded, rushing to the window. Red and blue lights were reflecting off the Newport mansion's manicured lawns. Impossible, Margaret breathed. All the local police are on our payroll. Not the FBI, Judge Sullivan said calmly. And not the Boston police who just heard Alice Chen's full statement. Barbara whirled around. What statement? About the third person in the kitchen that night, Sarah said, finally understanding. The person who actually poured the poison into my father's wine. She turned to Richard. It was you, wasn't it? Richard's face crumbled. Sarah, please. That's why you've been helping both sides, trying to ease your guilt while protecting yourself. Tears burned in Sarah's eyes. Your own father. He was going to ruin everything. Richard exploded. The inheritance, our reputation, the life I was promised. Mother showed me the proof about the twins, about how he'd betrayed her with your mother. She said if I helped her, we could keep it all quiet. By murdering him? Sarah's voice broke. I didn't know the poison would kill him. Mother said it would just make him sick, give us time to hide the evidence. Richard ran his hands through his hair. But then he died, and everything spiraled out of control. You foolish boy, Barbara hissed. Do you realize what you've done? Confessing in front of witnesses? Witnesses who won't survive the night, Margaret said coldly, raising her gun. Suddenly, the study doors burst open. FBI agents poured in, weapons drawn. FBI. Everyone on the ground. Barbara lunged for the fireplace, trying to throw the locket into the flames, but Sarah was faster. She tackled her stepmother, sending them both crashing into an antique table. The locket flew from Barbara's hand, skittering across the floor. No! Margaret turned her gun toward Sarah, but Judge Sullivan, who had been quietly working on her bonds, chose that moment to swing her chair into Margaret's legs. The gun went off, the bullet splintering the window behind them. Sarah Mitchell? An FBI agent helped her up. We have Alice Chen's full statement. And the video feed from this room has been streaming to our office for the last hour. Sarah touched her necklace, the simple silver chain David had given her that morning, with its hidden camera. He hadn't betrayed them after all, the phone call had been staged. As agents handcuffed Barbara, Margaret, and the security men, Sarah picked up her mother's locket. Inside, beyond the bank codes and the letter about the twins, she found something else, a small key. Father's private safe, Richard said quietly as an agent cuffed him. Behind the family portrait. Mother never found it. Sarah walked to the imposing painting of the Montgomery family, Barbara, Edward, and young Richard, all perfectly posed. No sign of the second child who should have been there. The safe opened with a soft click. Inside was a single envelope, addressed to her in her father's handwriting, for my daughter, on her 26th birthday. With trembling fingers, Sarah opened it. My dearest Sarah. By the time you read this, the truth about your birth will have emerged. But there's one final secret I've kept, one that even Barbara doesn't suspect. Your mother wasn't just my mistress, she was my first wife. We married in secret during my year abroad in college. When my family threatened to disinherit me, I chose wealth over love, divorcing her to marry Barbara. It's my greatest shame. The twin pregnancy years later wasn't an accident. Your mother agreed to be our surrogate to help pay for her medical school, not knowing the second child was her own. I've spent every day since then trying to atone for my cowardice. The controlling interest I've left you isn't just about money, it's about legacy. The Montgomery Foundation was originally created to help underprivileged students, before Barbara corrupted it. I trust you to restore it to its true purpose. Richard may have been raised in wealth, but you were raised with something far more valuable, your mother's integrity. I've watched you grow into the person I wish I had been brave enough to be. All my love. Your father. Sarah looked up to see Richard being led away, her twin brother now a stranger bound for prison. Barbara was still struggling with the agents, her perfect facade shattered. Margaret stood silent, her empire of lies collapsing around her. Judge Sullivan touched Sarah's arm. Your father's final gift wasn't the money or the company. It was the truth, and the chance to choose what to do with it. Through the broken window, dawn was breaking over Newport. In a few hours, Sarah would legally become the controlling shareholder of Montgomery Enterprises. The corrupt empire Barbara had built would be dismantled, its stolen funds returned to the charities they were meant to help. But first, there was somewhere else she needed to be. In a Boston hospital room, Alice smiled weakly as Sarah entered. I knew you'd figure it out, she said. You have your mother's mind and your father's heart. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Sarah asked, taking her friend's hand. Some truths have to be earned, Alice replied. Edward understood that. It's why he hired me to watch over you, to help guide you when the time came. Sarah pulled out her phone, showing Alice the document she'd drafted on the ride back to Boston. The Montgomery Foundation is being restructured. Its first new initiative will be a scholarship program for children of domestic workers, the Catherine Mitchell Educational Fund. Alice's eyes filled with tears. Your parents would be so proud. Outside the hospital window, the city was waking up to headlines about the Montgomery scandal. But Sarah wasn't thinking about the press coverage or the trials to come. She was thinking about choices, the ones her father had made, the ones Richard had made, and the ones that lay ahead of her. She had been born into privilege but raised in service. Now she had the power to bridge those two worlds, to transform a legacy of corruption into one of compassion. What she didn't know was that Barbara Montgomery had one final card to play, a secret so explosive it would force Sarah to make the hardest choice of all. Because sometimes, the price of justice is more than anyone should have to pay. 1 week after the arrests at the Newport mansion, Sarah sat in her father's old office at Montgomery Enterprises, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the promises of the future. The view of Hartford's skyline reminded her how far she'd come from serving wine in the mansion's shadows. Her phone buzzed, a text from the prison warden. Barbara Montgomery requests a meeting. Says she has information about your mother's death. Sarah's hand trembled. For years, she'd believed her mother died of natural causes, a heart condition that had plagued her through Sarah's childhood. But now, after everything she'd learned about Barbara's capacity for evil. You don't have to go, David said from the doorway. After the arrests, he'd been promoted to head of cybersecurity for Montgomery Enterprises. It's probably another manipulation. Probably, Sarah agreed. But I need to know. The prison's visiting room was cold and sterile, nothing like the opulent spaces where Barbara usually held court. But even in an orange jumpsuit, she carried herself like the queen she'd always believed herself to be. My dear stepdaughter, Barbara's smile was razor-sharp. Or should I say, my successor? I've been reading about your changes to the company. Very charitable. What do you know about my mother's death? Barbara's smile widened. Direct, just like Edward. Very well. Your mother's heart condition wasn't natural. It was the result of slow poisoning, small doses over years, administered through her medication. Sarah's blood ran cold. You? Oh no, dear. I had nothing to do with it. That was all Edward's work. You're lying. Am I?
Barbara pulled out a folder that her lawyer had apparently cleared.
These are your mother's medical records.
Notice the prescription changes every time she got close to discovering Edward's embezzlement from his own foundation.
Sarah's hands shook as she read the documents.
The dates matched every time her mother had visited Edward about Sarah, every time she'd gotten close to the truth about the foundation's original purpose, her medication had been adjusted.
He was embezzling from his own charitable foundation? Sarah whispered. Before I took over, yes.
Where do you think the initial money for Evergreen Ventures came from?
Edward wasn't the saint you thought he was.
He created the foundation to hide his own sins.
I just expanded the operation. Why are you telling me this? Because you have a choice to make. Barbara leaned forward.
Release these records to the press, and Edward's crimes become public.
Your noble father's legacy will be destroyed. The foundation you're so proudly rebuilding will be tainted forever. Or what?
Or help reduce my sentence. A few words from you about coercion and manipulation could make a significant difference.
In return, these records disappear forever.
Sarah stared at the woman who had been her stepmother, her tormentor, and now her prisoner.
You really don't understand, do you? Understand what? That legacy isn't about preserving lies.
It's about facing truth and choosing to do better.
Sarah stood up. Release whatever you want. Edward Montgomery's crimes don't change my responsibility to make things right.
She turned to leave, but Barbara's next words froze her.
He loved you, you know. More than Richard, more than anything.
That's why he kept poisoning your mother. He was terrified she'd take you away, expose everything. His love for you killed her.
Sarah didn't turn around.
No, his cowardice killed her.
Just like yours destroyed your family. The difference is, I choose to be brave. Back in her office, Sarah made 3 calls.
The first was to her PR team, preparing them for the release of Edward's records. The second was to Richard in prison.
Barbara told you, he asked quietly. You knew? I found out after his death.
It's why I helped Mother cover up his murder.
I thought I was protecting his memory. Protecting you. We can't protect people with lies, Richard. Not even the ones we love.
The third call was to Alice Chen, still recovering but now installed as the head of the restructured Montgomery Foundation.
Release everything, Sarah instructed.
Father's crimes, Barbara's expansion of them, all of it.
And double the funding for the Catherine Mitchell Educational Fund.
The board won't like that, Alice warned.
The board works for me now. It's time for the Montgomery name to stand for something real.
That evening, Sarah stood in the small cemetery where her parents were buried, Edward in his grand mausoleum, Catherine in a modest plot nearby. She placed roses on both graves.
I understand now, she said softly. Love isn't about protection or possession. It's about truth and choice. You both made your choices. Now I'm making mine.
Her phone buzzed with news alerts as the story broke: Edward Montgomery's original crimes, Barbara's expansion of them, Richard's confession, all of it.
The headlines would be brutal, the stock price would plummet, and the Montgomery name would be dragged through the mud.
But as Sarah walked away from the graves, her head held high, she felt lighter than she had in years. Because sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go of the lies we tell ourselves about the people we love.
6 months later, Sarah stood at a podium, addressing the first graduating class of the Catherine Mitchell Educational Fund.
My father built his legacy on secrets and lies, she told the assembled students. My stepmother built hers on greed and cruelty.
But you're building yours on truth and determination.
The scholarships you've received don't come from the Montgomery fortune anymore. They come from the profits of honest work, transparent dealings, and a commitment to real change. In the audience, Alice Chen wiped away tears. Judge Sullivan, fully recovered and reinstated to the bench, nodded approvingly. And in the back, watched over by his guard, Richard listened to his twin sister's words with a mixture of regret and pride. Sarah touched the locket she still wore, not for its secrets anymore, but as a reminder of where she came from and what she'd overcome. People ask me why I kept the Montgomery name for the foundation after everything that happened, she continued. The answer is simple, because names, like legacies, mean what we choose them to mean.
The Montgomery Foundation once stood for corruption and greed. Now it stands for education, opportunity, and truth.
That's not just a change in policy, it's a revolution of the heart. Later that night, Sarah stood at her office window, watching the lights of Hartford twinkle like the chandeliers she once served under. On her desk lay Barbara's latest appeal for leniency, denied, Richard's request for a prison visit, approved, and the latest foundation financial reports, completely transparent. The Montgomery empire had been built on secrets, but Sarah Mitchell Montgomery was building something new on their ashes, a legacy of truth, justice, and love. Because in the end, the servant girl who challenged the masters hadn't just changed everything. She had changed herself.